to the part of the evening where we're going to have a different type of conversation. And that conversation is going to be with the three people joining me up on stage. Beena Venkatraman from the Executive Office of the President serves as Senior Advisor on Climate Change Innovation. Denise Ross has flown up to be with us from the city of New Orleans, where she directs enterprise information. And Michael Simpson is somebody who, if you've been here today, you already know. He's the chair of our Environmental Studies Department at Antioch University, New England. I'm Abby Abrash-Walton, and I'm here wearing at least three hats. One of my hats is that I direct the Center for Academic Innovation at Antioch, and 2 years ago, Michael and another colleague of ours, Jim Gruber, who is somewhere here this evening, there he is, hey Jim, they submitted a proposal to do a feasibility study for what turned out to be this conference. So what you're experiencing here has been a 2-year gestation period, and I'm thrilled to see it come to life and to have all of you here. Yeah. So they really exercised a lot of leadership in taking the risk of mounting this extraordinary effort. And I am looking out at this group and knowing that many of you have also been innovators in your own right. So no one made you come to this conference, I don't think. All of you stepped up, you self-selected, you self-organized, and you got yourselves here because you are climate leaders and you are innovators in your own communities and in your own organizations and businesses and even in your own schools. So it's wonderful to have you here, and innovation is certainly going to be a theme of the conversation that we have this evening around climate preparedness. Another hat that I wear is as assistant to the president for sustainability and social justice at Antioch University, New England. And Steve Jones, my boss down there at the head table, said to me, "Remember my bedtime." Steve goes to bed very early. I said, "I'm not sure we can accommodate that this evening, but I'm going to do my best." So another theme that you have probably experienced in your first day of this conference is the focus on social justice, and certainly the theme of sustainability. And the third hat that I'm bringing into this conversation tonight is that I chair the planning board in the city of Keene, New Hampshire, which I'm very proud of. We have staff from Keene, we have city councilors from Keene. We would have had the mayor if he hadn't had to chair the city council meeting tonight. And Keene is an extraordinary place. It's a very modestly sized community with modest resources, and yet it achieves international leadership in the climate change preparedness realm. So much so that it was cited in the National Climate Assessment Report that was launched a few weeks ago as a model for adaptation planning. And it's a real privilege that I have to be a steward of our comprehensive master plan that has sustainability and climate change preparedness and adaptation woven throughout it. So we'll get into our conversation. The framework this evening is that we're going to have a bit of a talk with our three folks up on the stage, and then it's going to become interactive. And in the interactive portion, I hope you brought your cell phones, because we're going to be asking you to bring those out. And Ken Moraff from EPA Region 1 is going to take us through a keypad polling exercise, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation about the input that you offer this evening. And we'll open it up to some questions for our guests up on the stage. So here we go. So Nick, is my mic here working? Oh, good, okay. Thank you. All right. So I have a very soft voice, and Nick over there is helping me out by amplifying me. So welcome, first of all. Thanks a lot for being up here. And you know, when we were talking about this session, we thought about a theme that would be relevant for the three of you, and that's data. Data in multiple forms, both data that the federal government has and is now making available more widely, data that comes from the bottom up, from communities, data at the municipal level in New Orleans. And we thought that a good overall framing question would be, how do we get the right information both to the people who are in this room and others like you who need it for climate preparedness and community resilience planning and action, but how do we also get the right data from you to inform decision making? And so, Bina, I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about the Climate Data Initiative and what it's all about and what this audience might understand about it.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Abby and Michael, and I'll thank Steve. He said that if I went on too long that he would eat my dessert, so I'll thank him after he doesn't eat my dessert. I have my eyes on him. And thanks to everyone for being here and really for being, as Bob noted, pioneers in local climate change solutions, local preparedness and resilience. This really does take all levels of action, all levels of our communities, all levels of our economy and our governments to address this challenge. And it's a pleasure to be here to be a small part of it. So the White House Climate Data Initiative is a component of the President's Climate Action Plan, which, as Bob told you, has these three components: one around mitigation, cutting our greenhouse gas emissions, one around the international negotiation arena, and one around preparedness and resilience. And the Climate Data Initiative, put simply, aims to mobilize vast amounts of information and data related to climate change risks and impacts so that it can become actionable information to be used by decision makers in communities, in companies, and among the citizenry. So to do this, it's kind of a vast challenge if you think about it. The US government has a $2.5 billion annual investment in global change research. It includes the vast amount of sensor networks that monitor our oceans and our Earth observation systems, our satellites. It includes studies on the relationship between human health and climate change. It operates at many scales. And what we want to be able to do with this initiative is to make that information relevant for decision making within, as I said, sectors of the economy, within communities like many of yours. And to do that, we kind of have a two-pronged approach. One is we have to open up these stores of federal data. For a long time, a lot of these data sources have been, for mission-specific reasons, for purpose, built for purpose. Locked is probably too strong of a word, but been unavailable or inaccessible, undiscoverable by a lot of wide swaths of the public. The president, through his open data executive order in May 2013, kind of solidified what's been a theme of his administration, which is that the default switch needs to be turned to open on our data resources. But with the climate change challenge, it sort of further underscores the need to make data more open. With this sort of big data problem of all of these colossal data sets needing to be integrated, needing to make sense out of this challenge that we face of climate change, which we've been hearing about from all day from various folks, we recognize that we can't make sense of it alone, and that we can't be the only messengers. And when I say we, I mean the government, but also the scientific community. That we need to embolden and unleash a wide variety of innovators and messengers in order to carry the message of climate change risk and impact to decision makers. So the mode of this has been to say, first, we have to open up our data. And we have to think of climate change data as more than just the Earth observation systems data, more than just the data that arises from scientific studies. We actually have to think about our infrastructure data, our socioeconomic data, our population data, because all of these things bear on the question of how does climate change affect me, how does climate change affect my neighborhood, how does climate change affect my community, how does climate change affect my business. And so we recognize that those are all resources that we needed to look at, and we need to look across all the federal agencies and their assets for this endeavor. So we're opening up data. The other component of this is we are using what I think the president has aptly called the phone and the pen to encourage and stimulate the private sector, and by this I mean companies, foundations, but also civic innovators within communities like Keynes and many others that are here, to basically help us mobilize this data in new ways. And in March, we had a launch of our data initiative at the White House, and a number of these commitments came to the fore, including one by Antioch, New England, their commitment with respect to establishing the center that would be connecting science with communities, but also a range of others, including some from major technology companies. A question was raised in the earlier session after the keynote about, what are we asking our companies to do? And one of the things we're doing is we're looking at some of the major technology companies like Intel and Microsoft and Google and Esri, the company that makes ArcGIS, which is used by a lot of your communities, I presume, for planning purposes. And we're asking them to be part of meeting this challenge around climate information and climate innovation. So a range of those companies have made initial commitments. For example, Esri is partnering with 12 cities across the country to develop apps and maps that can be used for determining the risks of climate impacts such as heat waves, sea level rise, inland flooding, and then they're going to share those apps and maps freely across their platforms with users of those platforms, which given their kind of presence around the country and the globe, we thought was a significant commitment. But there are other commitments as well, including those by federal agencies, NOAA and NASA, posing an innovation challenge to try to stimulate people to try to characterize coastal risk in their neighborhoods. So all of this, I think we're going to have more time for interchange, but the goal of this is really to say, how do we unleash the creativity and the ingenuity of the American people to help us solve this problem, to help get the information in the hands of people who need it? We have a long way to go, and I think part of my real excitement in coming here tonight was because I think part of what we need to understand much better is what are the data and information needs that communities have? What are the kinds of decisions where data is crucial? What are the forms in which you get information already, and how can we kind of meet you there with the information and data that we're making available? Who are the partners we need to bring in to kind of make that happen? So with that, I'll turn it over.
Okay, that was a great opening. Thank you. And we will get to the interactive piece, and we will be hearing from you. So you can start formulating your comments right now to give input. So Denise, you were at the launch of the Climate Data Initiative, and you had a wonderful presentation, and you really brought it home with some direct experiences from your work in New Orleans post-Katrina and the challenges of getting access to data. And so carrying on the theme of open data, you've sort of become a champion for that and a thought leader in that area. Can you talk about some of the experiences from Katrina and why you've become such a vocal advocate for open data?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So for background, I moved to New Orleans in 2001, and there was so much promise at that point because it was the first time that the census data was being released and the internet existed. So there was this ideal that maybe we would be able to democratize data so it could be used by nonprofits and neighborhoods and citizens to take more control over their own destiny. And so that's what I did. I worked for a local data intermediary. It was a nonprofit. And we made census data very accessible to the people. We organized it into New Orleans' 73 neighborhoods. And we made the data highly locally relevant and easy to use. But then when Katrina hit and the federal levee system failed, we found that 80% of our city was underwater. And all of that census data became instantly historical. And our residents were scattered to all 50 states. We had a lot of work to do and a lot of decisions to make, but we were basically flying blind. And before the storm, I spent 5 years begging people to use data. And then after the storm, people were begging us for data, and there just was none. And there were some barriers to us getting data that we needed. The first was that the federal statistical system isn't really designed to keep up with such a post-disaster, rapidly changing situation. And on top of that, the concept of open data didn't exist. Nobody was talking about it at that point. And lastly, and probably most frustratingly for me on the ground, was that there was no access to administrative or transactional data from federal, state, or local government. In fact, a researcher at Brookings pointed out around that time that it had been easier getting data about the rebuilding of Iraq than it was New Orleans. And that was so validating for me to read that. But a remarkable thing happened, and that was that the citizens of New Orleans started collecting their own data because they needed the data to make decisions and to survive in this new normal. And so they started collecting data on property condition in their neighborhoods to inform the decisions they needed to make. And all of this data, if you think about it, if you're collecting data about your neighborhood, you need to know where the parcels are, because after a disaster, the unit of recovery is the parcels of land that are owned by different people, because those are going to be your levers for recovery. And so neighborhoods, nonprofits, developers, all of these folks needed the parcel layer, but because there was no culture of open data in local government, you can imagine what happened next. A bootleg copy of the data set got out, and there was one guy who worked for a nonprofit, and he became sort of a black market data broker for this parcel layer. And he actually, at the height of his power, he had federal agencies like FEMA coming to him asking for a city data set. And so people use this parcel layer all over the place in the city, and they even started to improve on its accuracy because we knew it had errors in it. But there was no channel for the city to either benefit from the ground validation of the parcel layer or to use the data that resulted from all of this citizen activity. And so it was sort of a shame because all of this data was maybe used to make fleeting decisions, but it didn't actually build the capacity of our city. And eventually, the residents burnt out. And so when I started to talk to residents in 2011 and 2012 about their data collection, they looked at me with these weary eyes, and they're like, we can't do that anymore. They needed government to do the heavy lift for them on that. This parcel layer proved to be of such high value that when I came to City Hall to start working in 2010, which was 5 years after the storm, I started getting one request a week for the parcel layer. This is 5 years later. And I started asking around, and we had been saying no to releasing the data for so long that nobody could remember why we weren't releasing it in the first place. So I drafted a memo, justified starting basically an open data program, and we released the parcel layer on box.net at the time. And now we have an actual open data portal. It's called data.nola.gov, and it's got dozens of high-value data sets like that, and we continue to add to it on a regular basis. But for me, the biggest learning from Katrina is the power of shared information. Because government can't do the rebuilding alone, citizens can't do it alone. We need shared information to make common progress. And I do think at this point that an open data platform and a culture of sharing in government is a basic requirement for resiliency.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of how common that is around the country for information to be held so closely at the municipal level?
I think it's probably mixed. And I think different data sets are held more closely than others. I brought a list of some of the data sets we're working on if you want. They're pretty garden variety. I mean, this is just good government, really. It's, what do you need to be resilient? You need something like a parcel layer. You need to know who owns the land. And this all needs to be public, right? You need to have public and easy to find zoning and land use data. But from the city side, we need to know what land we own, for example. And the city of New Orleans hasn't published that data, and it's not because we don't want to, it's because we don't have it.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think we'd have it. But we're a 300-year-old city, and there's such incredible, almost pathological complexity behind the scenes in our information systems as we, migrated from paper to various electronic systems that it's just not as easy. So some of the things that people take for granted that we have not invested in. Fundamental asset management, where are your fire hydrants, where are your storm drains, where are your trees, where are your power lines. So we're building the basics up, and every data set that we build out, we have solid use cases for, because it's so resource intensive to build a data supply chain. It's not just getting the data once, it's making sure that it's kept up to date. And so there have to be business processes in place that will keep the information up to date. So we prioritize based on how important that data is for decision making.
Great. Thank you. So we'll come back and maybe we'll hear a little bit from the audience about how open data works, for the municipalities that are represented here. So Michael, I introduced you as the chair of the Environmental Studies Department, but you have another hat. I know you have many hats, but one of them is that you're a climate adaptation scientist. And you deal a lot with data, and you deal a lot with what can be very complex and sometimes uncertain data. And you work with communities, either at a watershed level or at a county level or even at a municipal level. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how you translate that data. How do you make data relevant for people who need it to use it?
Well, I do. Is this on? Okay.
Nick, is he on?
Am I on? Yeah. Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
there we go.
I can't hear myself.
Yeah.
I agree with what I've heard from you two about relevance and
It's
meaning.
not on.
It's not on? Oh, I gotta turn myself on. Am I on? I can speak loud.
There we go. There we go. That worked.
I agree with the concepts of relevance and meaning, but I want to add 3 other concepts that I think we need to think about. And it's from having done, the last 14 years of research, mainly for applied research at the local level and not necessarily at large cities, but dealing with smaller communities and rural communities. And those 3 concepts are affordability, legitimacy, and also pathways. And so affordability, I like the idea of the Climate Data Initiative because what it's doing is creating innovation so ultimately data can be affordable. My research is funded by EPA and NOAA. These are large funded multi-year projects, and it basically applied to a number of communities in a basin or a region, but it was a sort of a one-off thing. And no one of those communities could ever afford me doing this work. And so the innovation that could come from corporate America as well as innovative academics would allow us to bring it down to an affordable level. But then it raises the issue of legitimacy. Basically, when will communities determine what data is legitimate? And if it becomes coming from Intel or Google or Esri, is it legitimate? And I will just give you an example. Cameron, you here tonight? Cameron headed up a research project for the Lamprey River Basin. I worked on that project, and what we were doing was remapping the 100-year flood zone using FEMA methodology. And we basically had created these maps, and then you presented it to all the communities, and they're looking at it and going, well, it's obviously good data. We translated meaning into the data, but what do we do with it? You're not FEMA. Okay, and so there's a real issue of bringing legitimacy into the equation. And then finally, it's the pathway, because I do work with rural and small towns and larger towns mostly, and the pathways that you're choosing, such as using the innovation and the latest ways we communicate, aren't necessarily the ways the people who actually implement things learn. And so we have to think about how we can translate this information into the correct pathways to get it to the right person. So if you want to convince a road agent that basically they need to work with other road agents, build legitimacy in what information they would use. And we're talking about a road agent that doesn't have a town engineer, has a backhoe and a bunch of culverts, and that's it. The question is, how do we get the information? What's the pathway, appropriate pathway for the appropriate audience? And those are things I've learned from doing my applied research.
Thank you. So there are 2 other themes that I want to touch on before we go to the keypad polling. And one is the innovation theme, looking for what's working, what's new, what's going to be helpful. And the other is the social justice dimension of this and how those innovations might help to strengthen resilience among the most vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so, Denise, when we had our initial conversation about this evening, you gave some great examples about innovations, systems innovations that the City of New Orleans is piloting to make sure that when the next Katrina hits, and hopefully the levees don't function in the same way that they did last time, but if it were to happen again, that those populations that were so devastated by that storm are better served. And I hope that you could talk a little bit tonight about what the city's doing.
Yeah, well, so one thing that New Orleans is doing that's starting to gain traction is increasing our resiliency to flooding by allowing for better water management. And I've heard a lot of talk about this today, about water storage and rain gardens and absorbent landscaping to catch the water where it falls. And one of the assets that we in New Orleans can really bring to bear in this is we have a lot of vacant properties now, as you can imagine. However, we don't actually know where all of the vacant property is. We have 149,000 parcels in the city, and we don't have a citywide view of where all the blight is, and we don't have a citywide view of where all the vacant land is. So it's hard for us to be strategic when we're thinking about how to more effectively live with water. And we've decided that this is a very high-value data set that's worth creating as primary data. And so what we've decided to do is separate the collection of the photographic imagery from the actual scoring of the attributes of the property, whether it's vacant land, whether it's a blighted property, for example. And so for about $300, we bought some high-end consumer-grade photographic equipment and attached it just inside the window. So if it starts raining, it doesn't get ruined. And it just peeks out of your window on both sides. And in about 2 to 4 weeks, we can drive the entire city and snap photographs, 3 to 5 photographs of each parcel. And then using GIS technology, we attach those photos to the parcels. And then where the real magic happens is that we've collected all that data in one fell swoop. So it'd be really easy to do a snapshot in time before an event to get a baseline. You could easily collect the photos after an event to find out what your damage, what your new conditions are. But we've separated the photographic collection from the actual scoring. And with 149,000 parcels, the barrier to us, we've been talking about this for 2 years now, but we couldn't afford to go to scale on paying people to score those photographs. And then we started to realize, being inspired by the innovation around climate data and climate resiliency, well, maybe we could crowdsource the scoring of the property condition. And so at the end of this month, as part of the National Day of Civic Hacking, we'll be convening a group of people who,
Maybe say that one more time.
I'm sorry, I forget, that sounds salacious. The National Day of Civic Hacking is a day where techies and designers and makers and hackers get together and they solve civic problems using open data. And so the problem that we want to solve is, how do you crowdsource the scoring of all of these photographs of properties? And so we're really excited. We've got people from Code for America coming. We've got people from Detroit. They struggle with some of the similar issues. People from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMaps team, Bina, will be there. And we have great subject matter experts inside City Hall. And this is what's really cool, is that we need this data so badly that up to the deputy mayor level, everyone is aware of this little innovation project that we're creating. So what we're looking to do is develop a reusable tool for crowdsourcing where admin assistants on their lunchtime could just score 15 properties, or after an event we could have international electronic volunteers helping to score the damage. And as the data starts to roll in, then we can start to make decisions. We won't be flying blind again. And in regular times, we can use that data to be more resilient, to choose where we're going to put our rain gardens and how we're going to more strategically deal with our blight.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, I think this issue of crowdsourcing is even deeper than Denise is giving herself credit for. I think what's happening in New Orleans and what's happening in a variety of communities, not just in this country but abroad, is inspiring. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Code for America, but it's an organization that pairs data innovators with cities to help solve civic problems. And one of the efforts that was part of the Climate Data Initiative came out of Philadelphia, Code for Philly, which is an effort completely civically led by citizens of Philly, including data innovators and others, to instrument city buses to monitor air quality and temperature There are a whole variety of efforts like this, and also to correlate that with open tree maps so that they could correspond where there's tree cover with different kinds of climate-related impacts and pollution-related impacts. So obviously there is this question of legitimacy and authoritativeness that that we can get back to, but I think that there's something really powerful when you're talking about vulnerable populations, and this came up in the session that Abby led earlier today, about thinking about information and data not just from a one-way transmission kind of point of view, but as a sort of two-way street, or in the district, we have these rotaries that have traffic coming in every direction. So let's go with that as our metaphor. But that there are sources of information that can come from communities, from neighborhoods, about parcels of land, about their sources of resilience, about their populations, that need to be part of the information, the collective information source that helps us deal with climate change. And I think, I'm always hesitant because when you talk about data, people, there can be sort of this tendency to talk about data as the solution to every problem. Well, data is not the solution, right? Data doesn't solve problems. Data don't solve problems, if you want to be grammatically correct, but who wants to do that? It's after dinner. So, it's about how data supports knowledge and how that knowledge then supports behavior change and action in communities. And that is supposed to be a virtuous cycle, right? So you want the data sources not just to be coming from the satellites down, as I said to Michael, but also from the ground up.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a good segue into the keypad polling. I think we could go there. Let's do the keypad polling. Ken, are you ready? Let's do that. And the way that we're going to do this, it's time to get your cell phones out.
You want to try?
And we're gonna collect some data from all of you and have some discussion about it.
So what are we doing here? We are experimenting with a way to collect information from an audience and engage the audience in the discussion. So this is something that you could take back to your communities if you were holding a community meeting about climate adaptation and you wanted to collect information, for example, about what are you concerned about, what impacts have you experienced, what kind of information are you looking for. You can get that from an audience pretty simply with these kinds of interactive tools. So this is a demonstration of that in part, and this is also going to give our panelists some information and some answers to some of the questions that have already been asked. So, a few instructions, and there are people walking around who know a lot about this system, so if you have an issue, raise your hand. So there are two ways to do this on a smartphone. You can either use the web interface or you can text your answers. The web interface is considerably easier, so please try that if you have web access. So here's how you do it. From your browser, there's the address to go to. It's pollev.com/climateprep. And if you go there, it should give you places where you can just check your response to the questions that we're about to ask. If you're going to try to do this by texting, you put in the text address is 22333, and then in the content section, you'll put in the number of the response that you want to give. Did everybody get that?
No.
So there's the code up there, 2233, and there are the numbers for the responses.
Okay, is anybody on the website now?
Yep.
Okay, a few people are on the website. All right, that's one end of the bell curve. Now we're going to hopefully go into the meaty part of that curve as more and more people figure out how to do this. Okay, so let's try the sample questions, see where we are. Okay, this is just a test. This does not count towards your grade. We're going to try this out. What's your pick for the 2014 World Series? The world champion Boston Red Sox.
Oh, people are already got, boy, this is fast.
You can see the interactive results coming in. The world champion Boston Red Sox, some team called the Yankees. I remember hearing about them in the 70s. They were good for a couple of years, but I haven't heard much since then. This is a trick answer. The Celtics, we all know they're a hockey team. And I don't know who the Simpsons are. Okay, so we see This is probably a third of the room, so some of you are figuring out how to do this. Again, if you're still having problems, raise your hand, someone will help you. So that's how The Simpsons work. Boy, I'm surprised the Yankees made it up to third choice. Okay, should we go to the first question?
It'll just appear, I think.
Oh, so I
It
need to
says
say we're going to stop. Okay.
Zero
All right.
response. Oh, there it is.
All right, so now we're going to go to the real questions. And I'm going to read them for people who can't see this all the way from the back of the room. So what best describes your organizational affiliation? Academic institution, community or nonprofit, municipal government, private sector company, regional planning commission, state, federal government, or other.
On this, you can choose two.
Oh, that's right. On this one, you can choose to. I should be referring to my notes. Yes, choose two, please. Your top
Choose
two.
No, this is just choose
No,
one.
oh, the primary. No, this
You're
is just
only wearing
one.
one hat, y'all.
Well, it gave me two on the, gave me two choices.
The next one is choose two. All right. So where are you from? All right. So it looks like government and academia and private sector are the top three, all very close. Fair number of planners, community nonprofits, a few municipal governments, and a few others. Okay, that's who's in the room. All right, we're getting up there in terms of number of responses. We probably have maybe 2/3 of the people in the room. All right, next question.
Academic, well, let's just keep a record of this. Academic institutions, private sector companies, and state and federal government have got the highest score. State and federal government got the highest score.
Yep. Okay. All right. For this question, the question is, when you're seeking data to inform climate preparedness, planning, and action, what sources do you most use and trust? And here you're going to choose your top two. The UN, IPCC, the National Climate Assessment and Regional Climate Assessments, federal government, state government, county and municipal governments, academic research data, NGOs, and others. Academia off to an early lead.
Let's fix that. Come on, you guys, get voting.
All right, federal government moving up.
You know, it's the academics who are in the climate assessment in the United Nations. That's all.
Yeah, all right. You can choose your top two here, so there should be a lot of votes in this category. We'll give it about 10 more seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1, and the results are in. All right, academic research data with 37, federal government 25, National Climate Assessment 24, UN 22. Other was 1. What was the other? Farmer's Almanac. Awesome. We forgot about the most authoritative source of climate predictions. Okay.
Oh, that's good.
All right, now we're moving from sources of data to types of data. So which of these types of data do you most need for climate preparedness planning and action at the local level? Elevation data, GIS data, precipitation amount or frequency, floodplain data, social economic demographics, wetlands, streams, and groundwater data, transportation and utility corridors, and other. On this one, you can choose, again, your top two. GIS and precipitation seem like the two largest. Give this about 10 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. The results are in. All right, GIS is the lead. Of course, GIS could include some of these other things. So that was a little bit confusing.
The big other down there.
Okay, so precipitation amount and frequency is second, and those two by far are in the lead. Wetland, stream, groundwater data, 100-year floodplain data, socioeconomics, fair amount of other there, elevation data. Okay.
Do you want to ask a
Did
question
some of the
about that?
others say what they were looking for?
Energy use data from local utilities. Impossible to get, really, really valuable. And health outcomes.
Okay, energy use data and health outcomes were suggested. Medical data, hard to get. Okay, and the last question, second to last question. So this next question is about our greatest needs, and you can choose 3 because we have a lot of needs. So the question is, to make effective progress on climate preparedness in our communities, our greatest needs are leadership, localized and accessible information, a point person or team for coordination, informed and engaged public, vulnerability assessments and asset inventories, examples of best practices, and other. You can choose your top 3. Leadership and an engaged public are the top 2. 10 more seconds. This looks pretty clear. Leadership first, engaged public second. 3 seconds, 2, 1, and that's it. All right, leadership at 43, informed and engaged public 35. Interesting. So you need leadership at the top, and you also need your public engaged. So it's got to come from both ends. All right, and the last question, this is a little bit different. This is not multiple choice. You can now put in a word or phrase that says what inspires you to innovate as a local decision maker or climate leader. And we'll see your responses as they come up here. No responses received yet.
That had to be you.
People still typing? Hockey. Wow. All right, I'll give this about 10 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Test is over. Put your smartphones down. So you can see
that's
what
nice.
kind of information this gives you, and it does engage an audience, gives you a chance to give some feedback to the panelists. You could ask whatever questions are most useful to you or most relevant to your audience. So the things that really jump out of that chart are as things that inspire us to act: future, children, community, generations, responsibility, and hockey. So thank you all for your participation.
That's good. So thank you all very much for indulging us in that exercise. That was interesting to see what we crowdsourced from all of you. And I wanted to open it up to the 3 of you to maybe offer some reflections on what you saw up there. Did anything surprise you?
Yeah, what surprised me was social demographic data was so low scoring. And we often think when we do our work, we're identifying things that are vulnerable as opposed to people. And you cannot, I don't think you can get to the people without that kind of information. And so it really does have a social justice component to it of what data you use. Mm-hmm. And what I heard, health data, is another one.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting. I guess the question was, we have such a range of academic studies supporting the National Climate Assessment, supporting the IPCC, as I think Bob was saying in the front row here. But to see that the resource of academic science, I'm not necessarily saying this is surprising, but it was marked. How many of you seem to be relying on academic studies? And I sort of want more texture on the answers, because I'm curious whether it is is it particular kinds of studies that are particularly useful in local planning decisions? Is it particular kinds of research that people are using, or is it these larger reports, these kind of these integrated assessments that are being used by folks for decision making?
But couldn't you interpret that question? I'll go back to my point.
Yeah.
Are academics considered more legitimate, and their information more legitimate as opposed to the other sources?
Possibly.
Don't know. We will open it up to questions and comments from everybody here. Not everybody, but those who are brave enough to go to the mic, and we'll get some of those. So maybe we'll get some responses to your question about that. Denise, did anything surprise you?
Well, going back to what Bina said, one thing that has frustrated me about the academic literature is that it's generally just a snapshot in time. And especially when you're tracking recovery, or you've got interventions and you want to see what the impact is over time, you need sustainable data that flows on a regular basis. And so that's where I think federal statistics and other data coming out of administrative systems and open data is so helpful for us at the local planning level.
Yeah, good. Other comments that you want to make on what you saw?
The motivation, it's all obviously future children. Those are big motivators. They're emotive motivators. I think it's hard to imagine the scale of challenge that our children are going to have to face, because we're facing a relatively new scale, and it's so I think if we can tap into that emotion, we actually may get a lot more participation out of parts of the populace that we don't normally see step up to the plate.
I was struck by the question about who the most important actors were, and leadership and engaged public came to the top. And certainly one thing we learned after Katrina is that if there's asymmetrical information, you can't get a collaboration between those two groups. And again, that's where a common base of information can be a real starting place. So you don't have to argue about the facts, you can just start talking about the solution.
I think so. Part of this, the approach of open data is only one of many approaches you can take. But I think, even thinking about the forthcoming EPA rules, there's a way of looking at climate change that we all, I think, in this room at least, sounds like we experience, which is to think of it as the profound humanitarian challenge, a profound environmental challenge, profound economic challenge. But there is this component of it that I think can be hopeful in thinking about the future and thinking about future generations, which is to think of the innovations, whether you look at the example of the automobile industry and how the efficiency rules, the standards are driving efficiency. We have opportunities that we haven't foreseen, just as we haven't foreseen all the consequences of this problem. And so I like to think that some of that future inspiration we can think about not just as a doomsday scenario of the future for our children, but actually as the possibilities that we can unleash if we make the right decisions now.
Great, thank you. So I think we want to open this up to maybe 2 or 3 people from the audience. Does anybody have a question or a comment, or anybody who wants to elaborate on what you meant by other?
Hi, I'm Katie Bush from Plymouth State University, and I just want to say that was a great activity. It was great to see so many people engaged, and as a researcher, it was really meaningful to see that the research that we do has meaning at the local level, because I think often we think of our research as up in this ivory tower, not being impactful. And so I just encourage you all to look for academic partners in the work that you do, because that's how we can really multiply our impact. And then to Michael's point about census data, I think, or socioeconomic data, I think the census has done a great job making their data available. And so maybe we don't think of it as something that we need, because we can just log on and download the data and get it. But getting real meaningful groundwater data or real meaningful, highly resolved precipitation data is much more challenging. And so I think, yes, it's important, but that maybe is easier to get than some of this other data. And so those are just two thoughts I had looking at those results. And thank you so much for putting on this conference.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Thank you for helping us interpret that data we just got. Okay. Is there anyone else? Wow.
Board, everyone.
We got one over there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. On the question of the difficulty with precipitation data, one of the issues that make it difficult is the supposed uncertainty of the data as you downscale it. There's always been uncertainty. I mean, the data that we've been using to come up with our design storms for our stormwater systems has been very uncertain, and there's a lot of controversy about whether to even publish it or not. We can manage the uncertainty. We have in the past. We can do it now.
That's a great comment. One of the analogies I like to use is a sort of a strained one, but that, we have this field of biomedicine from which we get all of this knowledge about disease, and it's down to the cellular level, and then it's also looking across big populations. But when it comes down to it, there's a patient and a doctor making a decision about a patient's health in our medical practice, in clinical practice, and looking at the history of that patient, looking at that patient's tolerance for risk, looking at particular factors that manifest in that patient symptoms. And I think, maybe what's part of what we need to develop is a sort of clinical practice, that sort of clinical practice for climate change, because there will always be some amount of uncertainty, but the question is, what's our tolerance for risk? What are the vulnerabilities that make particular communities more susceptible to certain outcomes or not? And how do we kind of make those decisions, right? How do we make them together, face to face?
Yes.
So I was struck, there was one thing I was struck by, and I thought, it may be just because of the audience, but where do you trust to get your data, or where do you want to get your data? Academic institutions were clearly the leader there, but if you look at the combined United Nations and National Climate Assessment, which is essentially done by an accumulation of academic authors, those three together were huge compared to all others. But one that struck me as at the low end was NGOs. I think there were like 3 people who may have identified, if I remember right, NGOs. I don't know whether that's this group or just a pattern that I hadn't realized.
Well, speaking as somebody who worked in that world for many, many years, maybe I'll let the audience in on a little secret, which is if I could get the State Department to say it in their Human Rights Country Report rather than my saying it, that was a good day. Because they were far more credible, and I would rather cite my own information with them saying it than for me to say it directly. So, there's a role for NGOs in doing this work, and sometimes being that credible source of data isn't really the right fit. NGOs can be better positioned to share information, help interpret it, build capacity in places that the people who are collecting the data and analyzing it and reporting about it don't reach.
I have
So-
noticed that some NGOs play an important role of being a data intermediary. For example, we get our hotel and motel occupancy data before big events like the Super Bowl from our Convention and Visitors Bureau, rather than from our revenue data, our administrative data set, for example, because the NGO knows that the hotel and motel business very well, and they vet the data, and it's better quality after they've processed it.
I would also add to that, NGOs can play a role as data innovators who are taking authoritative data and packaging it in ways that people can understand through maps and apps and other forms. And if there's someone from Climate Central here, they do that. They do that work. It has maybe a different audience than the planning audience, but it serves a purpose. It's reaching people where they are with data that they might not be able to access otherwise.
In my work overseas, actually, the NGOs actually carry a lot more panache as far as data and being able to disseminate it, especially in the developing world and developing economies, than you might see here in the United States. So,
Because of trust issues.
yeah, because of trust
Right.
issues. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to open it up to one more question or comment. Is there anyone else who wants to help us round out this conversation? Yes.
My name is Tom Burek. I serve as Commissioner at New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And this is an issue that in terms of data and data use, that all states struggle with, and we struggle with collectively with EPA. I think one of the real challenges is figuring out how do we not just collect data, but how do we make that data into useful information? And it's a beautiful thing to collect data for the academics. They can take it and do all kinds of things. I think we find here in New Hampshire, when we post just general data out on the website, academics or even commercial entities take it and use it for all kinds of things to try to spin new business. But if what we're really trying to do is to help communities and people in communities figure out how we're going to make them more resilient, what are we going to do to take the data that we're talking about here and actually turn it into useful information?
It's a great question. And we had a session this morning, one of the workshops, the pre-conference workshops on the role of psychology in climate change preparedness. And one of the things that psychologists know very well is that information by itself is often not enough. That's about directing the rider. And most of us aren't willing to spend that much time directing our riders. And so the information fix alone is often not sufficient, which is what I'm hearing about in terms of your question. So where do people come into this? Where do other systems of supporting and leading change come in? Beyond the data, life beyond the data.
Well, there's in New Hampshire, there's good examples of this. There's two climate adaptation working groups. One's a coastal adaptation working group, and there's one in the Upper Connecticut River Valley called the Upper Valley Adaptation Working Group. And they're actually a self-organized group of people that, and actually thought leaders and engaged public that basically translate the data for their members and actually provide events in which that data gets out. And so that kind of self-organization is great. Maybe it's unique to our neck of the woods, maybe it isn't. But in that kind of situation, they are the ones that are translating meaning. And because they're self-organized and they're collaborative and so they're membership-driven, the people participating determine what the meaning is and how useful it is as they go through that process. So it emerges from the collaborative process. And that may be a unique model that you don't see in other places, but it's been very powerful for those two working groups.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, to me, it somewhat goes back to this question of participation in the data gathering process. And there's some intersections here with citizen science and sort of where does the information come from if you want it to have meaning to certain audiences, right? If the information doesn't come from their own kind of self-knowledge and knowledge that they know about their communities, but is kind of from a much coarser scale, it's harder for it to be relevant. So I think part of the baked into the process of data gathering can be more relevant information to people and communities. But I sort of heard another dimension of your comment, I think, which is sort of how do you actually, everyone will go off and use the data for their own uses. How do you make it more broadly available? And I think part of the answer to this really does lie in public, academic, private partnership. And part of the model that we are attempting to use and advance is one in which, there are different value propositions to particular sectors of the economy. For example, the reinsurance sector has there's a value to that, some companies, in terms of public education about risk so that people can mitigate their exposure to risk. There's a value proposition to technology companies in having more people click on their platforms. There's a value to the public sector because we want the public good of our information getting out into the hands of people and into decision makers' hands, and we feel like that's the public trust to do that. So there are areas where these things intersect, and the academic community, of course, wants many of them, scientists increasingly, we have some examples here in the room, want their information to be used by a broader public beyond their peers in the scientific community. And so I think it's finding those mutual areas of value proposition where you can build those partnerships. And then I think the sandbox of climate change kind of provides us the opportunity to stimulate those kinds of partnerships because people realize that they're not going to solve it in their independent silos, that they have to jump in.
And I would add to that, when I was working for the nonprofit data intermediary, we learned that TV and radio are the most effective way to communicate data. And that made the biggest impact in our community, just sort of saying the same message over and over again across channels that the public was viewing. And then since I've been in government, we've had successes bringing some data sets. It was very resource intensive, but for example, with Code for America, we spent a year working with them to develop a very simple tool. It takes more time to develop a simple tool than a complicated one, just to look up the status of a blighted property so that the public didn't have to wonder, why haven't I seen any movement on this falling down house in the last 2 years? Now they could just type in the address and it very quickly brings up the whole history of that property and its interaction with our code enforcement department. But both of those are very resource intensive. That last 10% of translation is actually 90% of the effort. And so one thing I am always mindful of in government is there's some roles that only government can play. Like government is the only producer of many sets of primary data. And so I have to do that. And that's my responsibility. And then if I've got leftover resources, then I can innovate and maybe try to make that final connection. And if I don't have extra resources, then partnerships with nonprofits or educational institutions can help bring it the rest of the way.
Great. Okay. Well, big thanks to all three of you. And thanks very much.